It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio. Welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Shaun Haney, your host here on this Monday edition of the show, an Agronomic Monday version of the show. Hey, thanks so much for making RealAg Radio and Rural Radio 147 a part of your workday. And also a big shout out to everybody listening out there on the RealAg Radio podcast, Canada, the U.S., or beyond. It is great to have you a part of the community. Okay, it's Agronomic Monday. No Peter Wheat Pete Johnson today. That's right. Yeah, we're taking a pass on Pete. He didn't get enough espresso, coffee, caffeine to be all excited here. No, he's off today. He's out scouting fields, doing some hard work. So we're gonna tap into our crop schools here today. And also we got a field day that Kara was at. So we're out and about all over the place. So we're going to bring you some of that content here today on the program. Looking forward to it. Make sure you check out all of our crop schools with Real Agriculture. We got soybean, pulse, canola, corn, wheat. There's a soil school. There's lots of great stuff for you to check out at realagriculture.com. So encourage you to do that. Across the agronomic schools, we're producing over 150 videos through the growing season. That is incredible, right? And so it's on time, it's on demand. You consume it when you need it. You can do it in the tractor, you can do it at home, phone, tablet, laptop, desktop, however you want to consume the video content. We also podcast it on our podcast channel as well. So lots of ways for you to make sure that you're catching up to, you're keeping up, I should say, with the latest in agronomic discussions and research. Today we're going to hear from the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food, Claude Bibeau. She's going to talk to Kelvin Heppner about decisions made on MRLs and how that is a little bit different than the decision made on the ban of cosmetic pesticide use on federal land. We're also going to hear from an agronomist, Andrew Kippen from North Valley Precision Planting in Manitoba. He talked to Kelvin about things to think about, consider before we put that planter away for the season. Also, David Tarkalson, who's with the USDA out of Idaho, will talk to Kara about the value of manure, the application of manure, and things like phosphorus levels in an irrigation setting. And there's lots, growing irrigation districts in different parts of the country. And manure, obviously, a very, very valuable resource. And how do we make sure that we manage it appropriately in those situations? And we'll finish up hearing from Horst Bohner from Omafra talking about how uneven emergence can impact yield. And that is going to be a soybean school that we're going to listen to there. If you have any feedback on today's show, we'd love to hear from you. Lots of ways to get a hold of us. shaney@realagriculture.com is my email. You can also find us across all the different social media applications. YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, as well as TikTok. You pick, whatever one is your favorite, you can interact with us there. Paige Holmquist, our social media coordinator, does a fantastic job of trying to get some of the content out through all of the different social media channels. Or you can call the RealAg feedback line. The number is 855-776-6147. There's a lot happening out there right now. We're going to, in a bit here, we're going to hear from Minister Bibeau and talking about MRLs and pesticide use, the intention to reduce pesticide risk, not necessarily pesticide use. There's a difference there. What are your thoughts on that? Easy to get a hold of us and provide your feedback. We'd love to hear from you on any of these great topics because your opinion, your contribution to the discussion is just as important as anyone. So make sure that you're participating and you get me that feedback and we'll get to it here on the air. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to hear from the Minister of Agriculture, Claude Bibeau, right after this.
This year might bankrupt us. If I lose the farm, I'm letting down generations of my family. Why am I the only one who can't handle it? Maybe the farm would be better off without me. Hello?
Hey, I was just thinking about you and thought I'd say hi. I know it's been a hard season, and I wanted to see how you're holding up.
We might feel alone, but we're all in this together. Visit domore.ag for mental health supports tailored for the agriculture community.
How's your seed quality? What should you treat with? What about herbicide carryover and environmental concerns? Spring is here, and you've got a lot of things to think about in regards to your pulse crop. The Pulse School on Real Agriculture has information and advice for all these questions and more to help you navigate this season. Brought to you by BASF. Pulse School episodes are available at pulseschool.com, realagriculture.com, or as a podcast on your favorite streaming service. Download the latest episode today.
Infuse some energy into your next corporate event, customer meeting, or conference with RealAg Radio, Canada's national agriculture radio show. Create a unique experience at your next event with host Shaun Haney, broadcasting RealAg Radio live on SiriusXM, featuring exciting guests, captivating interviews, and the latest news from the agriculture community. Contact advertising at realagriculture.com or call 587-787-1795 to book your on location with RealAg Radio today.
Now, as we discussed last week on the show, there were some decisions made last week by the federal government when it comes to pesticide use, MRLs, cosmetic pesticide use. And there seems to be some sort of overlap, maybe some confusion in terms of the consistency in how science is being applied. On Friday's show, Kelvin mentioned that he had chatted with the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food, Claude Bibeau, and we're going to bring you that interview here today. So that's what we're going to do right now. Let's listen to Minister Bibeau and how she explains and talks about some of the differences in the messaging and why she feels they are being consistent in their application of scientific principles. Here's Kelvin Heppner with the Minister of Agriculture.
Joined just back from a visit to India. We're pleased to be joined by our Federal Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food, Claude Bibeau. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us today, Minister.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
So the government made a series of announcements this week as part of the larger agenda to update pesticide rules in the Pesticide Management Regulatory Agency, or PMRA. Can you fill us in on, from your perspective, what was announced this week regarding maximum residue limits and what this means for farmers across Canada?
Yes, of course. So about 2 years ago, summer 2021, we have decided to put a pause on the analysis of maximum residue limit on pesticides. PMRA, we felt that it needed we needed to have a look at it, and we wanted also to strengthen public trust around the process about concerning pesticides. So we have proceeded with a very important consultation. We have put in place an advisory board with independent scientists. We will be putting on the website, PMRA will be putting on its website a lot more information on the work they are doing, the analysis they are proceeding to, for more transparency. So this is one important part of what we have done until now. Yesterday we announced that we were ready to resume the analysis of maximum residue limit on pesticides. We'll start with the easiest one, I would say, and it will take a little bit longer for glyphosate in particular, because there are specific analyses that are being done elsewhere internationally as well, and we want to have access to these data, the results of these analyses, before we resume for glyphosate in particular. But I want to assure you that we stick on making decisions based on science. This is very important. So it's all about being more transparent and also giving more resources to PMRA so they have access to additional independent information before they make their decision. So this is a big part of what we have announced yesterday.
Okay. Agriculture groups have had concerns that the pause was bringing politics into a scientific process, the PMRA and Health Canada's scientific regulatory process. Some of the same concerns, I think, have also been raised about the creation of that advisory body. And now, together with this announcement yesterday, the government is also moving ahead with a ban on cosmetic pesticides on federal lands. Are you concerned as the agriculture minister about this sending a mixed or a conflicting message about the science that the PMRA uses to approve and review pesticides that farmers use?
No, actually, as the Ag Minister, I can assure you that I've been following this file very closely, and there is absolutely nothing around pesticides for farmers. Absolutely no intention to ban anything. We will keep making decisions based on science. We know that farmers are professionals. They know how to use pesticides. They don't know more. They don't use more than they need. They have other tools, and they do integrated management of pesticides. So, I mean, I want to really reassure farmers on that. We have made a commitment last December at the COP15 to reduce the risks, and I want to insist on reducing the risks associated to pesticide, to biodiversity, and this is why we have decided to stop using pesticides, non-essential pesticides for cosmetic use on federal property land, and we will encourage provinces and municipalities to do the same. But we recognize that pesticides are an essential tool to farmers, an essential tool to food security. And I can assure you that I've been following the file, and I will keep following the next step. And we will be careful. Food safety is above everything. Health of the people is above everything. But we're very confident on the process that PMRA is using. But it was okay to give more transparency. It's absolutely reasonable to ask for more transparency.
Do you understand the concern, though, in terms of the message that this might send to Canadians, saying that these products, sure, they're safe for farmers to use, but at the same time also pulling the use for federal lands in terms of the cosmetic use?
Well, there's a difference between the maximum residue limit that is closely analyzed by scientists and being confident that when it's used properly, as farmers do, doesn't pose a risk for human health. But it might pose certain risk for biodiversity. This is what we are also concerned about. So if we don't really need pesticides, or if we need it only for cosmetic use, when you analyze the risks that in the benefits, might not worth the risk if it's only to have a nice looking pelouse in front of your building. While when it's properly used, doesn't pose a threat to the health. It's essential to food security, essential for our farmers' livelihood. So the benefits we have no doubt on the benefits, and we know that it doesn't pose a risk for the health of people because we have been doing the right work on a science-based manner.
You mentioned the attention that's being paid to biodiversity, Minister. Is the process or the procedure for reviewing the MRLs going to change to reflect an increased focus on biodiversity?
No, the MRL are directly associated to the health, if there could be a risk for health, and there are no intention to change on this direction. So the other yes, we are banning the use for cosmetic use, the use for cosmetic purpose, but we are also investing in research and innovation. We are also developing new organic fertilizer, new precision agriculture tools. So there are many ways in an integrated management approach that farmers are using, and we will learn with all the research we're doing, new practices, new products that will come into the market. So adding all of this in the coming years, we're confident that we will achieve our target to reduce the risks associated to pesticides and the risk to biodiversity. This is what this is meant to be.
All right. A final question then. I'm curious what it was like in terms of your discussions with your fellow cabinet ministers that are involved in this file. Of course, this involves Health Canada and also Environment and Climate Change Canada. And all three ministers, you're all from the province of Quebec, where there seems to be more pressure from activists and from the community on this issue. As the agriculture minister and speaking up from understanding the use, the practical purpose of pesticides for farmers across the country, what was that discussion like with your counterparts at Cabinet in coming up with some of these policy changes?
Well, we all agree on making decisions based on science. It was important for the three of us to really understand what it was all about, because I would say that it took me a little while to really understand what maximum residue limits was about, and then be able to explain it to the population. And I was personally reassured. So I feel that when we can explain it properly, we can reassure people as well. And I think the three of us are making sure that the environment, the health, and our farmers' livelihood and food security, and not food security. Yes, food. Minister of Health is about food safety. I'm about obviously food safety. But also food security and farmers' livelihood. And the three of us have had great conversation, but I think we've found a right approach, more transparency for public trust purpose, and keeping our decisions based on science.
All right. Well, we know you have duties in the House of Commons here shortly, so thank you again for taking the time to join us today, Minister.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
That was Real Agriculture's own Kelvin Heppner talking to the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food, Marie-Claude Bibeau. Interesting. So it makes sense how she explains, I think, the difference between some of the decisions made on MRLs and the cosmetic pesticide ban on federal land. In the case of the federal land, as I'm listening to her talk, it does create some concern in my mind. The justification for biodiversity on federal land. Okay, now what happens if we were to apply that same reasoning on a broader sense in commercial agriculture? That would be, here's the thing. In agriculture, we're also concerned about biodiversity, right? But we also have this balancing act where we also are trying to grow crops, produce food, and it's complex. And this is something that the government obviously feels conflicted on. This is something that farmers are always trying to balance on an everyday basis. And I guess what I'm trying to say is what concerns me is if we just start to look through things through one lens, right? And we hear this all the time where somebody says, science-based decision making. And listen, we know this, that everybody has a different version of science. It's an interpretation. It's not like this. There's gray. It's not something that's like profoundly written in black or white. There's an interpretation to a lot of science, even, right? And so the wrong kind of science applied to the wrong situation, and we have a disaster. So this is something that I think the industry is watching very, very closely to ensure that the right science is applied to the right situation. So I appreciate Minister Bibeau providing some time. I know she was very, very busy as Kelvin was getting that interview scheduled. So fresh off that trip to India. And we're hearing a lot about India right now, right? Minister Bibeau had a trip. We saw President Biden was hammering out some I guess deals and some agreements with Modi from India. So India really in the news right now on the international scene for sure. Maybe a bit of a countermeasure with China from both sides, the North American countries as well as India itself. When we come back on RealAg Radio, we're going to continue with Agronomic Monday right after this.
Advanced canola trait technology is here. and it's soon to be the talk of the town. Optimum Glide delivers excellent yield potential and agronomic trait performance, improved crop safety, enhanced weed control, and a wider window of application. You're going to want to see this. Learn more at OptimumGlide.ca.
As you head out into the field this season, the Corn School's got you covered. Everything from tillage discussions, weed control info, field trial results, yield strategies, and more. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com has the information and advice you need to help you succeed. Brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF. Corn School episodes are available at cornschool.com, from RealAgriculture.com, or as a podcast from your favorite streaming service. Download the latest episode today.
Hi, I'm Bernard Tobin, host of the Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com. Throughout the year on the Soybean School, we'll bring you timely agronomic video content from planting to harvest, from the latest agronomic research to the latest in production technology. Check out our massive video library on YouTube, RealAgriculture.com, or download the audio podcast versions wherever you get your podcasts. The Soybean School is brought to you by Pride Seeds, BASF, and Syngenta Canada.
You know, one of the kind of weird things about agriculture is that there's certain activities, well, many of the activities that we do, we use a piece of equipment, we sprint with it, and then we don't see it again for 10, 11 months. There's a lot of examples. We got a seeder, we got a planter, a sprayer we're using over a more of an extended period, but still, say 3 months. The combine, the craziest piece of equipment when you think about it. The cost of the the cost of the combine, you use it for like 4-6 weeks. It costs you a fortune. Then you put it away in a shed or park it in the back of the farm. What a crazy business we're in. After you're done using, say the planter for the season, there's things you should do before you put that planter away. No different. There's things you should do before you put the sprayer away, the combine away. And we know that if we do that work right after the use, when we flip it over to next year and it's time to get going, the prep is a lot easier, right? We haven't created a whole bunch of problems for ourselves. In a recent episode of the Corn School, which is brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF Canada, you can go to cornschool.com. Real Agriculture's Kelvin Heppner dove into this exact topic. Here he is.
On this episode of the Corn School, we're talking planters with Andrew Kippen of North Valley Precision Planting here in southern Manitoba. And Andrew, planting is done. Time to put the planter away for the year. But before we do that, what should we be going over when it comes to planter and maintenance and some of the issues that we maybe dealt with during the planting season?
Well, I mean, this is a great time to look at the planter. Everything's still fresh in everyone's mind. You know, if there's some issues we had throughout the season, we can address it now and, you know, properly plan to how to, you know, make it better next year instead of waiting last minute, you know, and then rushing everything through to get it in the field. I mean, so the maintenance stuff, I mean, everything right from the bar back is your most important part of the planter, right? Mm-hmm.
So on each row unit, though, start at the front and kind of work your way to the back?
Yep. It's usually the easiest. Just follow as you go through the field, kind of how the, you know, the flow of the ground is going by your planter is the best way to look at it. So I always like to start with the row cleaners, if you have them. Not everyone has row cleaners, but I know a lot of guys in a drought, sometimes they'll try to knock off a bit of that soil, move it out of the way to find moisture or high trash conditions. They're running fairly aggressive to clear that trash out of the way of the row unit. One thing to keep in mind is that we're sending it far enough. If we're not sending it out of the way of the gauge wheels, we run the risk of, you know, rolling over top of it, which lifts the row unit, therefore changing depth on the planter, which, you know, cause a lot of early emergence like we've been talking about. Next is your disc. So the opening disc has a very important role. I mean, it's slice and open that soil, so we want that adjusted correctly so we can slice in the soil, push it to the side without disturbing it too much. Important adjustments on there are making sure we have that 2-inch contact. So that's usually rides that where the surface dirt would hit the disc. And the reason why that's important is so it doesn't fall in the furrow. So if you can picture, you know, a plow and it's open, well, you're letting all that ride right in there, dry dirt in the furrow, seed, never a good idea. So with that, there's a seed tube guard it's more than a seed tube. It actually holds the disc open, which actually sets the width of your furrow. So the width of the furrow is important because you need your seed to fall all the way in. So if you have a big seed in a narrow furrow, your seed may not get to the bottom, right? Seed tube guard also kind of prepares the ground floor of that furrow for the seed to fall into.
So is seed tube guard maybe a bit of a misnomer in terms of what it actually does?
It's probably one of the biggest overlooked parts of a planter, basically because of the name. You know, if I had my way, I'd change it. It should be a furrow creator, and that we'd look at that a little more differently than a seed tube guard.
Okay.
You don't need much of a furrow, or much of a seed tube guard to hold your seed tube. So.
Yeah. Next would be the gauge wheels.
Yeah, gauge wheels. I mean, that's important. So what we're trying to do with our gauge wheel is we're trying to firm the ground up as your discs open it, so that it doesn't collapse again before that seed drops in. So proper gauge wheel pressure is important, which it's tough to do in all conditions, because we got such varying land over, a course of a section, right, or even less. Hard to sandy land, which is why it's, so important to have, gauge wheel arms, gauge wheels, also with your parallel arms. You don't want things shaking and banging around. It makes everything real difficult. Also in this planter here, you can probably see that. I don't know if the camera's low enough, but there's we call it a seed firmer. So one, we can use it for putting liquid down. Also, it can help push that seed to the bottom of the furrow. There's a lot of guys that run them just for that reason only, just making sure that seed is all the way down. Went ahead of myself a little bit here, but going back to the gauge wheels, there's an adjustment on there that's very important. The contact point between them and the disc is the same as your discs. You don't want any of your dry dirt to slip between the gauge wheel and the disc, because it ends up in the bottom of the furrow, which we don't want, dry dirt down there. This one here is a little different than traditional. It's kind of got some aftermarket stuff on it. Normally the adjustment is done back here at the pivot point. On this particular one, we're doing it with shims on the gauge wheel itself. The gauge wheel arm, because sometimes we have that adjustment here, is threads. The threads can over time cut into themselves and actually start with a bunch of play. So it makes it very hard to keep that adjustment to the disc. So we got to watch that as play happens here. We got to maybe change them or verify that adjustment is still there. It will get to the point where you can't adjust it at all. So after the gauge wheel arm, we want to look at the depth stop. That's another part of the planter that I think is overlooked a little bit on how important it is. So with the gauge wheel arm and the depth stop, they kind of wear into each other, which changes your depth. It doesn't necessarily change the depth, but it definitely changes where your handle needs to be as it wears. So we got to get in there, make sure we don't have a huge wear point into it. It divots. This one here is a fixed depth stop, where some of the newer ones are a walking depth stop. So there's a bolt in there that can wear as well, because it's rocking on that. So we just got to keep in mind that those are a few wear points that it affects the depth quite a bit. Okay.
You keep calling it a depth stop, not a mustache?
The rocking one looks like a mustache if you were to hold it up, but on this planter here, it's a fixed depth stop, so it doesn't look like a mustache per se.
But that is another one of the variables that could influence your depth and differences between one row versus another row.
Absolutely. Yep. After that, closing system, we've got a pivot area. That's pretty important. This one again has got an update on it. It's got a bearing system put in there, so it's it's going to last a little longer. But a traditional one is usually a bushing that wears, steel and steel, if you will, and it'll move around. Therefore, your closing system there can move on and off your furrow, which doesn't allow the proper closing or proper pressure. It'll tend to wear the backside of this housing off, allowing this frame to move forward because of the spring pull that's in here. So as that happens, the spring tension gets less. So again, making sure we have enough closing pressure is very important. So as all that wears, so does that closing. It doesn't have the ability anymore. And then the gauge wheels, the closing wheels. These ones are smooth. There's a rubber surface on them. A lot of guys don't realize that you can flip them from side to side. Just keep the same wheel on this side, just flip it 180 degrees. Gives you a new wear surface. If you let it wear too long, eventually this rubber can fall off or this plastic gets thin. So it's kind of like rotating your tires. And we all do that on our vehicles, or should. Same idea here. Okay. So, and then the adjustment. Again, they're all on an angle. So there's a hidden access point that's below the ground, which we can't see. So where we want that point is at seed depth or slightly above. So we're keeping that seed where it is. We don't want to be below it, and we can lift it again, changing that depth.
Okay. And I guess right now, this time, as the crop is coming up out of the ground, it's kind of telling us how our planter performed as well, and maybe giving us some hints as to what we should be looking at on the planter.
Yep. So we're going to go to the field next, and this particular planter had a couple of rows that we weren't happy with, so we went and dug and found the seed and found out we were shallow. So we came back to the planter to kind of make sure we had everything set right, and found out indeed we had a couple settings off. Simple to do, quickly to overlook. But that's why it's so important to get into that field, go 10, 15, 20 feet, stop, get out and dig each row and make sure you're happy with the depth. And don't be done there. I mean, we may have to do this, and a few days later, a different field, different crop condition, different ground condition, just everything changes as we go through the year. So not just sit in the cab and plant.
Yeah. All right.
That was Real Agriculture's own Kelvin Heppner talking to Andrew Kippen with North Valley Precision Planting. And some of the things that Andrew's talking about there, obviously very specific to the planter. But whether it's the seed drill, the planter, the sprayer, the combine, pretty much any piece of machinery, before we put it away for the season, before we park it in the back side of that farm, let's make sure that we go through it. Do the maintenance now, right? Do the maintenance now so that when we get to 2024, you're ready to go. You're in a much better position to go, especially if we have some of those things that we know, those preventative maintenance things that we know we have to fix. Oh, when the unit can run, but we know that eventually I got to fix that, or we're gonna have a breakdown, right? I got to replace that, or I got to do this. Those things get lost in a winter. So I think this is good standard practice for all of us. Because last week on the show, we heard from Case talking about, getting your combine ready for the year. A lot easier to get it ready for the year if last December, November, you did some of the work to put it away. That it really kind of begins in the fall for the upcoming season. So great stuff there in the Corn School. Make sure you go to cornschool.com. When we come back on Real Ag Radio, we got more of Agronomic Monday right after this.
If you're involved in the agriculture industry, it's important to stay informed on all the latest issues affecting your business. At RealAgriculture.com, we offer fast, reliable news, information, and insights to help you keep on top of all of the latest in Canadian agriculture. Visit RealAgriculture.com and sign up for our free daily newsletter covering everything from news, agronomy, animal agriculture, and much more. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe today.
Whether you're seeding, harvesting, or anything in between, the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com has you covered. Timely agronomic information from industry experts available online anytime. Give your wheat crop a good start and a great finish with the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com. Brought to you by C&M Seeds, Syngenta Canada, and the Alberta Wheat and Barley Commission.
This season, if you're thinking about boron, I want you to think about Granubor from US Borax. Ask for it by name. Make sure you go to borax.com. Well, At a recent Farming Smarter Field Day here in Lethbridge, Alberta, Kara Oosterhuis had a chance to talk about manure application and the power of manure, the value of manure. There's a lot of manure in this area because we are living in Feedlot Alley here in southern Alberta for sure. There's a lot of livestock production, as there is in other areas of the country. That manure is so valuable. Now, we need to also focus on making sure we're using it appropriately given the context and the application that we are faced with. What about under irrigation? That's exactly the topic that Kara hit on. Let's listen to her discussion right now.
Hey, Kara Oosterhuis here with RealAgriculture.com. I am here today at the Farming Smarter Field Day in Lethbridge, Alberta, and I have here with me Dr. David Tarkalson with the USDA. How's it going today?
It's going great.
So you're down here or up here, I guess, from Idaho. Mm-hmm. Do you want to tell me a bit about your position down there?
Well, I'm a research agronomist with the Agriculture Research Service, which is USDA's agricultural research branch. And we do research anywhere from crop production, animal production, all the way to food quality as well. And so I'm here speaking about nutrient management under irrigation. So I'm from southern Idaho, which is basically fully irrigated. So all of our research there is done under irrigation. And I also spend a lot of my time working on nutrient cycling within cropping systems, as well as in irrigation management as well.
So today you were here talking mostly about manure legacy and how that kind of works, especially under irrigation. Do you want to talk about some of your research there? Yeah,
so in the past, maybe 20 years ago, when I worked for the University of Nebraska, and with a lot of the current recommendations for nitrogen availability under manured situations, they tend to give a timetable, say like 3 to 4 years of nitrogen being released from that manure that can be utilized by crops. But we found in Idaho, at least in our soils, that these manure applications can have a much longer effect in terms of nitrogen release, as well as other factors we don't understand yet on crop production, all the way up to say 13 years after manure application. So that application of manure can have a longer term positive effect on crop production than we used to think it did.
And how does water availability play into this?
Well, water, as we know, is the main limiting factor in dryland production systems. So it's the number one thing that will control the system in terms of yield and production. And so when you're limited in water, that tends to be the thing that reduces yields, etc. Right? It's not necessarily going to be nutrients. But when you're irrigating, you're able to meet the full crop demand, and so water is no longer limiting. Therefore, you kind of stabilize the production of that system, and so you don't have to worry about weather as much because you have the water available through irrigation, and so then you have to start focusing on your other nutrients that can be limiting production.
So what are some of the other things you found? Like you said, there were some unknowns when it comes to manure. What are some of those unknowns you're looking at or considering?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the microbiome. So the microbiome is a term that is supposed to encompass all the microorganisms in the soil. It can be bacteria, fungi, etc. And so that whole community of microbes in the soil and what they're doing. It's a very complex system, and we just don't understand it well. Like if you take a little bit of soil and you go to the lab and culture it, there's a small fraction of those bacteria, perhaps, or fungi that you can actually grow in the lab. The rest of them you can't. It's a very complex environment that we don't understand very well. And so our research is trying to better understand what is that microbiome doing that influences crop production, that influences carbon sequestration, etc. And so that's what we're trying to do. So it's more than just the nutrients you're adding in the manure. It's the effect of that manure on the native microbiome and how it's changing, and that microbiome's effect on crop production that we're trying to better understand. And to tell you the truth, I kind of equate it to our universe, right? We're here on Earth, and we're trying to understand our universe. It's very complex. Everything's very far away. And I would say the soil microbiome is on that same level of lack of understanding as our universe, to tell you the truth.
Now, I don't want to paint everyone with one brush, of course, but do you think we are, for the most part, applying manure too often?
In some situations, you probably can. So I'm sure it's the same here with your cattle industry, right? So it's the ground that's around, adjacent to the cattle feeding lots, etc. So down in Idaho, we're dealing with very concentrated dairy production, and so most of the manure is applied on area around there, and so you tend to start having problems with too much phosphorus, and that being an environmental water quality issue with runoff, etc. So that can be a concern when you're putting too much on those areas. But if you look at the whole land base around that, most of that ground is not getting manure, and we know from our research that applying a moderate amount of manure can have a very positive effect, and maybe even managed correctly is not going to have much of a negative effect at all. And so it's all about putting the manure where it needs to go, not where it's most convenient to apply it.
So with that comes soil testing, of course.
Yes.
When have you found most optimal for soil testing when we're trying to figure out manure applications?
Well, I would say this is, if you're talking about testing, there's two main ones you're going to think about, right? You're thinking about nitrogen applications, right? Trying to somehow understand how much nitrogen you're going to be putting on for that crop and how much that crop needs. But for both an agronomic and environmental standpoint, it's the phosphorus, right? So phosphorus is not necessarily toxic per se to most crops. So if you have high phosphorus, you're not necessarily going to have for most cases, a negative effect because that phosphorus will be made available to the crop, but it's more of an environmental issue. So you're looking at both agronomic and environmental levels with nitrogen and phosphorus in particular.
Okay, sounds good. And what's the longest you talked about 13 years. Is that the longest you've looked at manure applications? Yeah, so when I was in my presentation today, I was talking about 13 years post-manure application, but that was last year. This will be year 14 this year. But that's just when we put the manure on, it wasn't meant to be looked at over the long term. Yeah. It was meant to be like a short term study, like most of our research is, over 4 or 5 years, right? But so that happened slightly before when I got to my current job, the manure was being applied. And then about 5 years later, I took a break, and I said, well, what's happened with those plots, So we decided to go back and look at them again, and that started this whole idea of, boy, wait a second, this manure is still affecting crop yields, it's still affecting how much nitrogen is available in the soil. We're still seeing a positive benefit from this manure when we shouldn't be, based upon the recommendations, right? So what's going on here? So that led to us continue to look at it. So we'll continue to look at these same plots well into the future. And now, Idaho, just like southern Alberta here, we do have some similarities, lots of sugar beet production. Mm-hmm. How did you see the uptake with manure on sugar beets? Well, we have some data with sugar beets grown on manure, right? And in a study of one of my colleagues, are finding that with really high manure rates, you can see some quality issues. But even though the quality decreases a little bit with high manure application rates, the yields have shot way up. The sugar beets love manure, and they get really high yields. But even when you take into account that lower quality with the increased sugar content, that even with high manure, the amount of money the producer is getting back is still higher than when there's no manure being applied. But that's a very complex system, because when you have high impurities in your sugar beets, it causes problems in the factory, and they don't want that. And so it's a very more complex than just you put this on, you get this certain yield, and you get paid for that. So there's positive effects and some negatives that have to be looked at as well with high manure applications on sugar beets. Okay, absolutely. Anything else you'd like to add about your research? Well, I guess one of my main messages today is that we have found, at least in southern Idaho, that research data is really important. And it's not just and also if you're a researcher or if you're a grower, or don't look at the research in the last 4 or 5 years, but make sure that every piece of research we're doing is a part of a piece to a puzzle. And so all the past research you've done, if everything is analyzed as a whole, we can make much more advancements than we can by being too narrowly focused on the most current research. Yeah, absolutely. Great message. Okay, thank you very much for your time.
When we come back on RealAg Radio, we're going to hear from Horst Bohner of Omafra. He's going to talk about how uneven soybean stands really do impact yield. You're listening to RealAg Radio, Rural Radio 147.
Peter Johnson at WheatPete, RealAgriculture.com. I'm the host of The Word, and I love doing The Word. I love the questions. I love the challenges. I love having to apply agronomics to all over the globe and areas outside of my normal jurisdiction. Also, I love the feedback the most, where growers challenge me, tell me about their plot results, help me to learn. The Word, absolutely the best part of my day.
Canola is more than just a pretty face in the prairie landscape. It's a big business, both here and around the world, that requires you to be informed and up to date on everything it takes to grow a successful crop. The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com has an expert library of video resources covering markets, agronomy, and more to help you grow a healthy and profitable canola crop. Visit canolaschool.com today. Brought to you by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
We're going to talk about soybeans right now, but really across all the different crops. We know that even emergence is really a critical component to really getting that higher yield. And there's a lot of research in corn showing just hours, never mind days, of difference in terms of emergence can have an impact. Getting that crop out of the ground as evenly and at the same time as possible is absolutely critical. Now, obviously, there are some things working against us here. One is moisture. I made the drive late last week through the Highway 2 corridor, and around Sturgeon Valley County, for example, or Sturgeon County, I should say, you can see a lot of patchy fields. Well, that staginess has to do with moisture. Hard to get that canola crop out of the ground super even when you're dealing with a moisture deficit. So in ideal situations, this is what we're striving for. Not always applicable in all applications. Let's hear from Horst Bohner from Omafra. He's talking to Real Agriculture's own Bern Tobin. They're looking at soybeans and how uneven emergence impacts yield.
Today, we're going to talk about emergence, uneven emergence and variability, and who else to talk about that than Horst Bohner, Omafra's soybean specialist. Sir, how you doing?
Excellent. Nice to see you.
Awesome. Hey, I want to talk about this field. Now, we've got plants that are 2 growth stages ahead of some of the emerging soybeans here,
right.
And it almost looks like a replant, but it's not.
Yeah, this is an interesting scenario. We have a lot of fields this year, especially on clay soils where the stand is much thinner than we'd like. Now, of course, what we were hoping and thought would happen in a lot of cases is that rain on the 11th of June would all of a sudden fill those holes and you get beautiful emergence, because if that seed is sitting truly in dry soil, then it can sit there for a long time. And actually, Bernard, that's exactly what happened in this field. The seed was sitting in dry soil that is just emerging now. Right. And you look at these little seedlings, beautiful. This is going to be a full, perfect stand. And then you look at the bigger plants, and you kind of go, well, how can that be? Well, they had enough moisture that they emerged. But here's the problem. A lot of fields don't look like this because that initial seed got a little bit of moisture, and then it actually rotted before it could come up. And so that's when we get into that, do you replant? Yeah. And a lot of guys did.
Yeah, and what you didn't replant here, you've got, as I say, you've got plants at 2 different stages.
Yes.
What does that mean for management going forward with this field, Horst?
Well, one of the beautiful things about soybeans compared to other crops like edible beans is that we don't get too excited about differences in maturity. The general rule of thumb is that for each 3 days later in terms of emergence or planting, right, if it's the same kind of number of days from planting to emergence, there is a 1 week or 1 day difference in the fall. In other words, it's a 3-to-1 ratio. Right. If they come up 3 weeks later, they'll only be 1 week later in maturity in the fall. And of course, as soybeans go, we'll be able to harvest everything at the same time, and they'll be just fine. Now, they will be 1 week later, of course, compared to what they could have been. But unlike edible beans, where you can get into dockage and, they're not... It's a mess in the fall. We don't have that problem in soybeans. Now, the one thing, of course, is you still have to keep the field clean. So you got to think about those weeds are often bigger, so you can't wait for the soybeans to get as big as we usually do. Right. You got to hit hit the weeds pretty hard. Like, you got to stage the herbicide more according to the weeds than the soybeans.
Because you've got soybeans at two different stages here. I want to ask about yield potential here, and because some people would say, "Hey, let's replant this," and I'm going to come in with another 80,000 seeds and try to build the population. But you say, there's lots of yield in that first planting, and that second replant doesn't bring a lot to the party when it comes to yield.
Yes, and it really depends on the soil type and, of course, how even that stand is. And that's where it gets a little bit academic in terms of saying, well, this field will be fine. It would be if the whole field was the same. But often there's, of course, in this scenario, you get the knolls that are worse, and they might only have 20,000 plants, and the rest of the field is at 110. What do you do, right? And certainly, as a general recommendation, 100,000 plants per acre, we would not reseed for sure. Now, here's the interesting point to what you're getting at. There was some good research conducted where they planted in on top of a poor stand, right, with a 30-inch corn planter. And they say, well, how much of the yield comes from that second planting versus those already established, relatively poor stand? How much comes from that first stand? And the answer is the vast majority of yield. You can see from this chart, it's actually amazing how little yield came from that replanting or that thickening. But keep in mind, this is research. This is, exactly the same kind of even part of the field. So that's why I don't actually talk that much about this research, because I'm not comfortable with a real thin stand, especially in parts of the field where it's terrible. And so if we got to go in there and thicken that stand, then get her done. Yeah. I would say right till the end of June, no problem. Get in there and fill her up.
Do some stitching. So a lot of guys use.
Sure, yeah.
I want to talk finally about yield, and that is, the situations that we have. A field like this, we have replants going on in the last week or two. It's getting late June. Yes. Question for you: how much yield potential do we have left when we're planting this late? What can end up in the bin come October?
Oh, absolutely, right. I mean, as we all know, August is what really matters for soybeans. Have we lost some potential as we get into June? No question. I mean, we've done planting date trials forever now, and it's 5 to 8 bushels less potential. But that does not mean you can't get 55 or 60 bushels. It just means it may have been 68 bushels had it been planted earlier, but it's impossible to predict yield today. So certainly we are not ready to say that it's not going to be a good crop. It could still be a terrific crop, even planted the very last day of June, believe it or not.
Awesome stuff, sir.
The Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Pride Seeds, Syngenta Canada, and BSF Canada. Big thanks to our sponsors of the Soybean School. You can watch all the episodes of the Soybean School by going to soybeanschool.com. And with all of our crop schools, they're all on, of course, our website, RealAgriculture.com, but they're also on our YouTube channel. When you're at our YouTube channel, make sure you hit subscribe. If you have any feedback on today's show, how are you making on your farm agronomically? We want to hear about how things are looking. Make sure that you send me an email, shaney@RealAgriculture.com. You can also find us across all the different social media platforms as Real Agriculture. Or you can call that RealAg feedback line. The number is 855-776-6147. That's 855-776-6147. Thanks, everybody, for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Radio, and we'll chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.